The highway stretched endlessly before Emily and Claire as they left Florida, the southern sun setting behind them in a haze of oranges and pinks. Their small sedan was packed with snacks, half-empty water bottles, and the remnants of a carefree week spent with friends. They laughed and sang along to the radio, the kind of light-hearted energy only a road trip could bring. As they crossed the state border, the mood began to shift. The open road seemed to grow darker and quieter. Claire fiddled with the radio as the signal faded into static, and Emily tightened her grip on the wheel. It wasn't fear, just the unease of leaving something familiar behind. Emily glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearly midnight, but they had no plans to stop. They'd agreed to drive straight through the night, splitting shifts, so they could get back to New Jersey by morning. Emily wasn't tired yet, but her back ached from hours behind the wheel. "We'll pull over soon," she said, breaking the silence. Claire nodded, her face illuminated by the faint glow of her phone. She'd been scrolling aimlessly, her usual chatter replaced by a quiet focus. It wasn't like her, but Emily didn't press. They had a long way to go. A couple of hours later, Emily spotted a sign for a town advertised as a tourist haven. Promises of quirky shops, cozy diners, and clean restrooms seemed too good to pass up. "Let's take a break," she suggested, her voice tight with fatigue. As they exited the highway, the road curved into a quaint-looking town, or what should have been quaint. The streets were deserted, the buildings weathered and worn. Faded signs hung limply in windows, and the occasional flicker of a neon light cast eerie shadows on the pavement. Emily's chest tightened. Something about this place felt wrong. Their first stop was a convenience store on the outskirts of town. It stood alone, its fluorescent lights buzzing like a trapped fly. Emily parked the car and stretched, her joints cracking in the cool night air. Inside, the store was clean but eerily quiet. The cashier, a tall woman with dark brown hair and suspenders, watched them with a polite but distant expression. Claire wandered the aisles, grumbling about their lack of her favorite drink. Emily chuckled, grabbed a Gatorade, and paid without incident. For a moment, things felt normal. As they left, Claire spotted another convenience store directly across the street. "Maybe they'll have my drink there," she said, already heading toward it. Emily followed, more out of habit than curiosity. But as they stepped inside, Emily froze. The cashier looked identical to the woman from the first store. Same hair, same build, same blank expression. Her heart raced as she approached the counter. "Do you have a twin?" she blurted out. The cashier frowned. "No, I'm an only child," she said flatly, her eyes narrowing. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Emily dragged Claire out of the store, her hands trembling. "Did you see her? She's the same as the other one," she hissed. Claire raised an eyebrow. "I don't know, I wasn't paying attention. You're probably just tired." Determined to prove she wasn't imagining things, Emily insisted they go back to the first store. But when they returned, the cashier was someone completely different. A middle-aged woman with short blonde hair. Emily's stomach dropped. "I swear it wasn't her," she whispered. Claire sighed, clearly unconvinced. Emily's unease grew as they drove deeper into town, searching for a gas station. When they finally found one, it was empty. Not a single car filled the lot. Claire climbed out of the car, muttering about her drink again. While Emily went to pump gas, the silence was oppressive. Even the sound of the gas pump felt muted, swallowed by the stillness around them. Emily glanced toward the small building at the back of the lot, its windows dark and uninviting. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. When they walked back to the car, Emily froze. The once empty gas station was now packed with vehicles. Cars lined every pump, and the parking lot overflowed with people milling about as if it were a rush hour. Claire's eyes widened. "Where did they all come from?" she whispered. Emily didn't respond, her heart pounding in her chest. Worse than the sudden crowd was how everyone seemed to stare at them. Cold, unblinking eyes followed their every move as they climbed into the car and drove away. The highway felt like a refuge after the nightmare of the town. Claire was uncharacteristically quiet, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "That was weird, right?" she finally said, breaking the silence. Emily nodded, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Neither of them could explain what had happened. The town felt like a bad dream they were desperate to wake up from. But the road ahead didn't feel any safer. The darkness seemed thicker now, the headlights barely cutting through it. Just as they were beginning to relax, a car passed them, a battered Toyota Sienna with a spiderweb crack in the windshield. Emily barely noticed it at first, but Claire commented how rundown it looked. They laughed nervously, the tension easing for a moment. But 10 minutes later, the same van passed them again. It was identical down to the crack in the glass and the scratches on the side. Claire sat bolt upright. "That's impossible," she whispered. Emily didn't reply. Her foot pressed harder on the gas. Emily's heart raced as she tried to rationalize what they had just seen. Maybe it's not the same van, she muttered, though her voice betrayed her doubt. Claire shook her head, her eyes locked on the road ahead. No, it's the same one, Claire whispered. Same crack, same scratches. I swear it passed us already. Emily gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles pale. She didn't want to admit it, but she felt it too. Something was very wrong. The GPS chirped with directions, breaking the oppressive silence in the car. Emily glanced at the screen. They had been driving for hours, yet the map claimed they had barely made any progress. That can't be right, she said, tapping the screen. Claire leaned over, her face pale as she stared at the route. How are we still here? We've been driving non-stop. The highway stretched ahead, a black ribbon cutting through endless darkness. The familiar landmarks of interstates were gone. No exits, no signs, just road. Out of nowhere, the van appeared again. This time, it wasn't passing. It was parked on the shoulder of the road, its hazard lights blinking in the darkness. Claire gasped, clutching Emily's arm. Don't stop, Claire begged. Just keep driving. Emily didn't need convincing. She pressed the gas, her eyes darting to the van as they passed. In the driver's seat was a shadowy figure, unmoving, staring straight ahead. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The figure didn't turn to look at them, but seemed to radiate a palpable sense of dread. Minutes later, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Emily's chest tightened as the lights grew closer. It's them, Claire whispered, barely audible. The van was back, tailing them at an uncomfortably close distance. Emily tried to calm her breathing. It's just a coincidence, she said, though she didn't believe her own words. She sped up, but the van matched her pace, its cracked windshield gleaming like a spider's web in the beams of her taillights. Suddenly, the van's lights disappeared. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. Emily's shoulders relaxed slightly, but the relief was short-lived. The dashboard clock caught her attention. It was an hour later than it should have been. Claire noticed it too. What the hell? She murmured, her voice trembling. Neither of them had touched the GPS or changed the time settings. Emily's stomach churned. Time wasn't working the way it should, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being toyed with. The GPS directed them onto an exit ramp. Grateful for any change in scenery, Emily followed the route. But when they reached the bottom of the ramp, her stomach dropped. They were back on the same highway. That's impossible, Emily whispered, her voice breaking. Claire grabbed the GPS, her hands shaking. We didn't loop around, she said. We've been driving straight. How are we back here? The road was the same, dark, empty, and suffocatingly still that as they drove in silence. The radio crackled to life. Static filled the car, followed by a faint, garbled voice. Emily and Claire exchanged a glance. Turn it off, Claire said quickly, panic rising in her voice. Emily reached for the dial, but before she could touch it, the static shifted. A woman's voice, cold and mechanical, whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The radio went dead, Claire screamed, and Emily slammed the button to turn it off, her hands trembling on the wheel that up ahead. The faint outline of a figure appeared in the middle of the highway. Emily slowed the car, her headlights illuminating a person standing motionless on the center line. It's not real, Claire whispered, her voice shaking. Don't stop, Emily. Just go around. But as they approached, the figure turned its head slowly toward them. Its face was featureless, a smooth expanse of pale skin where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. Emily's blood ran cold. She swerved, narrowly avoiding the figure, and sped into the darkness. Claire was sobbing quietly in the passenger seat, her arms wrapped around herself, as if to ward off the growing terror. Emily kept driving, her eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. Finally, an exit appeared, a chance to escape. Without thinking, Emily turned on it, desperate for a way out. But as they descended, dread filled her chest. The road below wasn't an exit. It was a narrow, winding path that led straight into dense, oppressive woods. The road twisted and turned, the trees pressing in on either side like silent sentinels. Claire's sobs had quieted, replaced by a tense, eerie silence. Emily's hands were slick with sweat as she gripped the wheel. Then, through the trees, she saw it again, the van. It was parked at an angle, blocking the road ahead. This time, the driver's door was open. Emily slowed, her heart hammering in her chest, but she couldn't see anyone inside. Turn around, Claire whispered, but her voice was barely audible over the pounding of Emily's pulse. Emily hesitated, her foot hovering over the brake. If I turn around, we might end up back where we started, she muttered, half to herself. Claire shook her head violently. Anywhere is better than going toward that van. Emily made a split-second decision and threw the car into reverse. reverse. But the second she began backing up, the trees seemed to shift, their twisted limbs closing in like skeletal hands. Claire screamed as the road behind them vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of shadow. With no choice, Emily slowly approached the van. As the car crept closer, she noticed something in the passenger seat. A figure slumped over, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Claire's voice broke the silence. "Emily, I can't do this. Please, let's get out of here." Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. The van's driver door creaked as if nudged by an invisible force. Then, the slumped figure began to move. The figure turned its head toward them, its movements jerky and unnatural. Through the cracked windshield, Emily saw it clearly, a face just as featureless as the figure they had seen on the road. Neither Emily nor Claire could look away as the featureless head tilted as if observing them. Then, without warning, the figure reached for the door handle. Emily slammed the gas, swerving around the van and narrowly avoiding the trees. The car shot down the winding road, its tires screeching as Emily tried to keep control. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches clawing at the car like desperate hands. "Where does this road even go?" Claire cried, gripping the dashboard. "I don't know," Emily shouted back. The GPS had gone dark, its screen blank. It was as though the road was leading them deeper into a trap, with no end in sight. As they drove, an eerie sound began to echo through the woods. It was a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the car. Claire clamped her hands over her ears. "What is that?" she screamed. Emily shook her head, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't know. It's coming from everywhere." The hum grew louder, more distorted, as though the forest itself was alive and angry. After what felt like an eternity, the road widened slightly, and a small clearing appeared. In the center stood a lone gas station, its fluorescent lights flickering like a dying heartbeat. "Should we stop?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Emily hesitated but nodded. "We don't have a choice. We're almost out of gas." As they pulled in, the hum faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt even worse. The station looked old, almost ancient, with a single pump and a building barely held together by warped wood and peeling paint. Inside, the attendant stood motionless behind the counter, his head bowed. Emily stepped out cautiously, her every instinct screaming at her to leave. The man didn't look up as she entered, but his voice rasped through the air. "You're far from home, aren't you?" She froze, unsure how to respond. The man slowly raised his head, revealing hollow, empty eyes that seemed to see straight through her. Claire stayed in the car, her hands trembling as she locked every door. Through the window, she watched Emily interact with the attendant. Though she couldn't hear the words, his movements were unsettling, too slow, too deliberate. When Emily returned, her face was pale. "He told me not to take the road ahead," she said, her voice shaking. "But he wouldn't explain why." "Then let's not," Claire snapped. But Emily shook her head. "It's the only way out, Claire. There's nothing else." As they left the station, Claire glanced in the rearview mirror. Her breath caught in her throat. A shadowy figure was standing at the edge of the clearing, its outline barely visible against the darkness of the woods. "Emily, drive faster," Claire yelled, her voice breaking. Emily pressed the gas, but the figure didn't fade. Instead, it seemed to grow larger in the mirror, as though it were following them despite never moving. The road forked unexpectedly, with no signs to indicate which path to take. Emily hesitated, her grip tightening on the wheel. "Left or right?" she asked, her voice trembling. But Claire's response was frantic. "I don't know, just pick one." Emily turned left, the tires skidding slightly on the gravel. But as they rounded the corner, both women froze. Ahead of them stood the van, its hazard lights blinking in the suffocating darkness. Emily slammed on the brakes, her hands trembling. The van sat there like a predator lying in wait. Claire gripped her arm, her nails digging into Emily's skin. "Turn around. We can't go that way." Before Emily could respond, the van's headlights flickered on and off like a silent warning. A cold shiver ran down her spine. The hazard lights blinked in sync, an unnatural rhythm that felt like a coded message. "We're being watched," Emily whispered. That as Emily threw the car into reverse, the engine sputtered and stalled. She turned the key repeatedly, but it wouldn't start. "No, no, no," she muttered, panic setting in. Claire's breathing quickened. "Why now? Why is this happening now?" The van's lights dimmed, and the vehicle seemed to melt into the shadows. The road ahead was empty again, but the oppressive feeling of being trapped lingered. Emily's hands shook as the engine finally roared to life. She didn't wait to see what would happen next. The road narrowed, leading them to an old bridge. Its wooden planks looked fragile, barely held together by rusted bolts. "We shouldn't cross that," Claire said, her voice wavering. wondering, what other choice do we have? Emily replied, glancing at the gas gauge. It was dangerously low. As they drove onto the bridge, the car groaned under the weight. Beneath them, dark water churned, but there was no moon or stars to reflect on its surface. Halfway across, the car jolted as if something had struck it from below. What was that? Claire screamed, clutching her seatbelt. Emily's knuckles turned white as she gripped the wheel. Another jolt sent the car lurching to the side. Emily glanced in the rearview mirror, but the darkness behind them was impenetrable. Hold on, she yelled, flooring the gas. The bridge groaned in protest as the car sped forward. Once across the bridge, Emily pulled over to catch her breath. The silence was deafening, but then the radio crackled again. Static filled the car, followed by the same cold, mechanical voice this time. The words were clearer. Turn back while you can. Claire covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. I can't do this anymore, Emily. I want to go home. Emily's hands trembled, but she forced herself to keep moving. We'll get out of this. We have to. The road stretched endlessly ahead, twisting and turning in impossible ways. Emily couldn't tell if they were moving forward or just circling back to where they started. Claire stared out the window, her face pale and hollow. Do you think we're stuck? She asked softly. Emily didn't answer. The thought had crossed her mind more than once. The GPS was still blank, and the clock on the dashboard blinked 12 o'clock, as if time itself had ceased to exist. The fog began to roll in, thick and suffocating. It clung to the car, reducing visibility to mere feet. Claire gasped, pointing out the window. Did you see that? Emily strained her eyes, but saw nothing. What did you see? She asked, her voice tight. There were people, Claire whispered, walking along the road. Emily shook her head. It's just the fog playing tricks on you, but deep down, she wasn't so sure. The fog grew thicker, and with it came faint whispers. They drifted through the car, low and unintelligible. Claire whimpered, her hands over her ears. Make it stop, Emily. Please make it stop. Emily focused on the road, her jaw clenched. It's not real, she said, trying to convince herself as much as Claire. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the woods were alive and trying to lure them deeper. Out of the fog emerged shadowy figures, lining both sides of the road. They stood motionless, their heads bowed, their forms barely distinguishable from the mist. Emily slowed the car, her breath catching in her throat. Don't stop, Claire begged. Just keep driving. Emily nodded, her foot pressing the gas pedal. As they passed, the figures turned their heads in unison, their featureless faces following the car's movement. Just when they thought they had left the worst behind, the van reappeared. This time it was parked in the middle of the road, its hazard lights blinking erratically. Emily slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding. This can't be real, Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. The driver's door opened slowly, and a figure stepped out. It was the same faceless entity they had seen before, its movements deliberate and unnatural. Emily's mind screamed at her to flee, but her body refused to move. Emily gripped the steering wheel tightly, her foot frozen on the brake. The faceless figure stood motionless in the road, its head slightly tilted as if observing them. Claire's voice broke the silence. Emily, what are we going to do? We can't sit here, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. She tightened her grip, her knuckles white. The figure took one step forward, then another. Each movement sent chills through her body. Hold on, Emily muttered, and floored the gas pedal. The car surged forward, aiming directly for the figure. Claire screamed, covering her eyes, but Emily didn't stop. Just as the car was about to collide, the figure and the van shimmered like a heat mirage and disappeared entirely. The car passed through the space, leaving nothing but silence behind. Emily gasped, struggling to steady the wheel. What the hell was that? Claire whispered, her voice shaking. Emily couldn't answer. Her heart pounded too loudly in her chest. The road ahead warped and twisted, its surface shimmering unnaturally. Emily slowed the car, her stomach churning. What's happening to the road? Claire asked, gripping her seat. Emily didn't respond. She focused on the asphalt, which seemed to ripple like water. The yellow dividing lines bent and curved, leading them in impossible directions. This isn't real, Emily muttered, her voice shaky. But the car kept moving, as though guided by an unseen force. Claire glanced into the side mirror and froze. Emily looked in the mirror. Emily hesitated, then stole a glance at the rear view. Her blood ran cold. The reflection didn't show the car or the road behind them. Instead, it revealed the gas station they'd left earlier, surrounded by shadowy figures. It's following us, Claire whispered, her voice breaking. Emily quickly adjusted the mirror, unable to look any longer. Don't focus on it, she said, her voice trembling. Just don't look. The clock on the dashboard dashboard, stuck at 12 o'clock, began to flicker. The numbers distorted, forming symbols neither of them could understand. Then, with a sudden burst of static, the clock shattered, the glass splintering into the car. Claire yelped, shielding her face as tiny shards rained down. "What's happening?" she cried. Emily didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the road. But in the faint glow of the shattered clock, a shadow seemed to shift across the dashboard. A piercing scream erupted from the radio, cutting through the silence like a knife. Emily and Claire both jumped, their hearts racing. "Turn it off," Claire yelled, reaching for the dial. Emily twisted the knob, but the scream only grew louder, blending with distorted whispers. "It won't stop," Emily shouted, slamming her fist against the dashboard. The noise abruptly cut off, leaving an eerie, oppressive silence in its wake. No matter how far they drove, the scenery never changed. The same twisted trees lined the road, their gnarled branches clawing at the car like desperate hands. "We're not getting anywhere," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. Emily clenched her jaw. We can't just be stuck." But the growing dread in her chest told her otherwise. The road seemed to stretch on forever, a loop they couldn't escape. Out of the darkness, a road sign appeared, its metal rusted and warped. Emily slowed the car to read it, but the letters were smeared and illegible as if deliberately obscured. Claire squinted, her face pale. "It says, 'Don't stop.'" Emily's heart skipped a beat. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice tight. Claire looked at her, tears streaming down her face. "Because I heard it. In my head, another bridge loomed ahead, this one even older and more decrepit than the last." The wood creaked ominously as the car approached, and the water below seemed unnaturally still. "We can't cross that," Claire said, panic rising in her voice. "We don't have a choice," Emily replied, her grip tightening on the wheel. As the car rolled onto the bridge, the structure groaned, and the air grew heavy with the scent of decay. Halfway across, Claire screamed, pointing at the water below. Emily glanced down and nearly lost control of the car. The water wasn't water at all. It was a black, undulating mass, writhing as though alive. Shapes moved beneath the surface, their forms grotesque and unnatural. One of them rose higher, its faceless head breaking the surface, staring directly at them. Emily pressed the gas, the car lurching forward as the bridge threatened to collapse beneath them. As the car sped off the bridge, the wooden structure gave a final, agonizing groan and collapsed behind them. In the rearview mirror, Emily caught a glimpse of the black mass swallowing the remains. Claire clutched her seat, shaking uncontrollably. "What was that?" she screamed. Emily's mouth was dry, her hands trembling on the wheel. "I don't know and I don't want to find out," she replied, her voice strained. The radio crackled back to life, emitting soft, static-filled voices. This time, the words were almost clear. "Keep going, not far now." The eerie calmness of the voice sent chills down Emily's spine. "Not far to what?" Claire asked, tears in her eyes. Emily didn't answer. She turned the volume down, but the voice only grew louder, the words echoing in her mind. The trees lining the road seemed closer now, their branches reaching toward the car like skeletal hands. Emily swore she saw eyes watching them from the shadows, glowing faintly like embers in the night. Claire whimpered, "They're getting closer." Emily glanced at her, fear evident in her eyes. "Don't look at them. Just keep looking forward," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The van was back, parked across the road ahead. Its hazard lights blinked irregularly, casting eerie flashes into the surrounding darkness. Emily slammed on the brakes, her heart racing. "We can't go around it," Claire said, panic in her voice. Emily gritted her teeth. "Then we go through it again." But something about the van felt different this time, more solid, more real. The van's driver's door creaked open, and the faceless figure stepped out. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like it was savoring their terror. Claire screamed, clawing at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Emily felt frozen in place, her foot hovering over the gas pedal. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at them. In the distance, the whispering voices grew louder, forming a chorus of unintelligible warnings. Without warning, the figure stepped back into the van, and the vehicle vanished before their eyes, leaving the road empty. Claire burst into tears, shaking uncontrollably. "I can't take this anymore," she sobbed. Emily swallowed hard, gripping the wheel. "We're not stopping. We're getting out of here," she said, more to herself than to Claire. She floored the gas, the car roaring forward into the endless dark. Ahead, a faint light flickered in the distance. It wasn't the warm glow of a town or the steady beam of a streetlight. It was erratic, like a failing bulb. Emily and Claire exchanged a wary glance. "Should we go toward it?" Claire asked hesitantly. Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming no, but with nowhere nowhere else to turn. She kept driving, the light growing closer with every passing second. The flickering light belonged to a dilapidated motel, its neon sign struggling to spell out vacancy. The building itself looked abandoned, but the parking lot was full of cars, all eerily pristine as though freshly washed. "We should keep going," Emily said, her voice firm, but the car sputtered and stalled again, the engine dying completely. Claire's wide eyes met Emily's. "It doesn't want us to leave," she whispered. Reluctantly, Emily and Claire stepped out of the car and approached the motel. The air was thick and oppressive, the silence broken only by the hum of the broken sign. Inside, a single key sat on the counter, attached to a tag that read Room 7. "This feels like a trap," Emily said, her voice trembling. Claire didn't respond, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Against their better judgment, they took the key and headed down the dimly lit hallway. Room 7's door creaked open, revealing a scene that made their blood run cold. The room was an exact replica of Emily's bedroom back home, down to the smallest detail. The same bedding, the same photos, even the same faint smell of lavender. Claire stepped back, shaking her head. "This isn't possible," she whispered. Emily's heart pounded as she scanned the room. On the bed lay a single photograph of the two of them, taken earlier that day, except they had never taken such a photo. Emily stepped into the room cautiously, her breath shallow. A mirror hung on the wall above the dresser, but the reflection was wrong. It didn't show them standing in the doorway. Instead, it displayed the gas station parking lot filled with shadowy figures, all staring directly into the glass. Claire gasped, grabbing Emily's arm. "We need to get out of here," she whispered harshly. Emily nodded, but her feet felt glued to the floor, unable to move away from the chilling reflection. When they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them, the lock clicking into place. Claire lunged for the handle, yanking with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. "We're trapped," she cried, panic thick in her voice. Emily grabbed her arm. "Calm down. There has to be another way out," she said, though her voice was shaking. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. The walls began to hum softly, growing louder with each passing second. Words whispered in an unrecognizable language seeped from the cracks. Claire clapped her hands over her ears, backing away from the walls. "Make it stop," she screamed. Emily tried to stay calm, but the whispers seemed to burrow into her skull. She stumbled to the bathroom door, praying it wasn't locked too. To her relief, it opened, but the room beyond was anything but safe. The bathroom wasn't a bathroom anymore. It was an endless void, black and featureless, with no floor, ceiling, or walls. A faint wind howled from its depths, carrying the same whispers they'd heard moments before. Emily slammed the door shut, her heart racing. "This isn't real," she muttered, as much to herself as to Claire, but the growing sense of dread told her otherwise. Claire's trembling hand reached for the photograph on the bed. "Don't," Emily warned, but Claire picked it up anyway. The image had changed. Now, shadowy figures loomed behind them in the photo, their faceless heads tilted unnaturally toward the camera. The figures seemed to move slightly, shifting positions every time they looked away. Claire dropped the photo, backing into the dresser. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. A sudden knock echoed through the room, slow and deliberate. Emily and Claire froze, staring at the door. The knock came again, louder this time. It wasn't a human knock. It was hollow, reverberating unnaturally, like something massive was on the other side. "Don't answer it," Emily hissed, pulling Claire away from the door. But the knocking persisted, growing more forceful, shaking the walls with every strike. As the knocking continued, the ceiling began to crack. Thin lines spread across the plaster, revealing dark, inky voids beneath. A low growl emanated from the cracks, sending shivers down their spines. Claire whimpered, clutching Emily's arm. "We're going to die here," she whispered. Emily shook her head, trying to summon courage she didn't feel. "Not if I can help it," she said, her voice trembling. Desperate, Emily yanked open the dresser drawers, hoping for something, anything, that could help them escape. In the bottom drawer, she found an old, rusted key. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally heavy. Claire glanced at it, fear etched across her face. "What's that for?" she asked. Emily didn't know, but a deep instinct told her it was important. "We'll find out," she said, pocketing the key. Emily's eyes fell on the closet. Something about it felt off. She approached cautiously, gripping the rusted key tightly. When she opened the closet door, she found a small, hidden hatch at the back. "This has to be it," she said, her voice wavering. Claire shook her head. "We don't know what's down there," she protested. Emily glanced back at the cracking ceiling and the still knocking door. "Do you want to stay here?" she asked. Claire swallowed hard and followed her. The hatch opened to reveal a steep, rickety staircase descending into darkness. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint smell of decay. Emily led the way, the rusted key still clutched in her hand. Every step creaked under their weight, and the darkness seemed to press in closer with each descent. Claire hesitated on the steps. "What if this is worse than what's up there?" she asked, her voice cracking. Emily didn't answer. She was too focused on the faint light flickering at the bottom of the staircase. At the bottom of the staircase, Emily and Claire found themselves in a narrow hallway that stretched far beyond what seemed possible. The flickering light they had seen was now a bare bulb dangling from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows. As they stepped forward, the floor beneath them groaned. Claire whispered, "This place, it doesn't feel real." Emily nodded silently, her grip tightening on the rusted key. The whispers from the motel walls had returned, louder and clearer now. They seemed to come from the very air around them, speaking in a language neither of them could understand. Claire clutched her ears. "They're in my head," she cried. Emily pulled her forward. "We have to keep moving. Don't stop," she urged, her voice resolute despite the fear in her heart. A door appeared on their left, marked with a symbol that looked like an eye. Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "Do we go in?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Emily shook her head. "Not yet. Let's see where the hallway leads." But as they turned away, the door creaked open on its own, revealing pitch darkness within. From the darkness of the room, a shadowy figure began to emerge. It moved unnaturally, as if it were a projection rather than something solid. Its faceless head tilted toward them, and it raised an arm, beckoning silently. "Close the door," Claire shrieked. Emily slammed it shut, her heart racing. The whispers grew louder, almost mocking, as if amused by their fear. Further down the hallway, they came to another door. This one was marked with the same rusted key symbol Emily had found. Her instincts told her this was what the key was meant for. Taking a deep breath, she inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a loud click. Claire grabbed her arm. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. Emily nodded. "We don't have a choice." Inside the room, they found what looked like an old, dusty living room. The furniture was covered in sheets, and the air smelled of mildew. On the coffee table sat a collection of photographs. Emily picked one up, her blood turning cold. It was a picture of her and Claire, but not from any moment she remembered. In the background, the faceless figure stood, barely visible in the shadows. As they examined the room, the whispers transformed into voices they recognized. Emily heard her mother calling her name, soft and pleading. Claire heard her brother's voice, begging for help. Tears welled in Claire's eyes. "It's them, they need us," she exclaimed, rushing toward the source of the sound. Emily grabbed her arm. "No, it's not real. They're trying to lure us in," she said firmly, pulling her back. Suddenly, the walls of the room began to crack and crumble, revealing the void beyond. The whispers turned to shrieks, loud and piercing, as if the very fabric of the room were protesting their presence. Emily and Claire darted for the door, but it slammed shut in front of them. The faceless figure appeared in the corner, its head tilted as though observing their panic. "What do you want?" Emily screamed. The figure raised a hand, and the room fell silent. It pointed to the photographs on the table, then to the door as if giving them a choice. "What does it mean?" Claire whispered. Emily hesitated, then grabbed one of the photographs and held it up. The figure nodded slowly, stepping aside as the door creaked open again. Emily swallowed hard. "We're playing its game," she muttered. They stepped out of the room, the hallway now different. It was no longer narrow and oppressive, but wider, with faintly glowing symbols etched into the walls. The air felt heavier, each breath labored. Claire looked back, but the door they had come through was gone. "There's no turning back now," Emily said, gripping the rusted key tightly. The path ahead was unknown, but one thing was certain. They were deeper into the nightmare than ever before. The faintly glowing symbols on the walls pulsated, their light casting eerie shadows that seemed alive. The whispers had faded, replaced by a deep, rhythmic hum that vibrated through the air. "What do these symbols mean?" Claire asked, running her fingers over the carvings. The moment she touched one, her hand recoiled as if burned. The glow intensified, and the hum grew louder. Emily grabbed her arm. "Don't touch anything. This place reacts to us." The hallway split into two paths, each identical except for the symbols above them. The left bore the symbol of the rusted key, while the right had an unfamiliar mark, a circle with jagged lines cutting through it. "Which way?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Emily stared at the key symbol. "We stick with what we know," she decided, leading Claire toward the left, but as they stepped forward, a low growl emanated from the right path, sending chills down their spines. The hallway seemed to stretch and compress as they walked. The walls moved subtly, making the space feel alive. Claire tripped and fell, scraping her knee on the uneven floor. As Emily helped her up, she noticed the wall beside them had shifted, forming what looked like a face, faceless, but with features pressed from behind, straining against the surface. It disappeared as quickly as it appeared. "Keep moving," Emily urged. They heard footsteps behind them, slow and deliberate. Claire froze, her eyes wide. "Is someone following us?" she whispered. Emily turned, but the hallway behind them was empty. The steps continued, growing louder and closer. They picked up their pace, the sound mirroring their every move. When they broke into a run, the footsteps turned into a deafening stampede, echoing through the corridor. Ahead, they encountered a door marked with the same rusted key symbol. Emily quickly pulled out the key and inserted it into the lock. The door resisted at first, but with a forceful twist, it gave way, creaking open. Inside was a room unlike any they had seen. It was small, with walls covered in mirrors that reflected not their current selves, but distorted versions with blank faces and contorted limbs. Claire whimpered, backing away. "I can't go in there," she said. The voices in the mirrors began to speak, overlapping in a cacophony of phrases. Some were familiar, words they had spoken earlier in the night. Others were sinister, mocking whispers that seemed to know their deepest fears. Emily covered her ears, trying to block them out. "We have to get through this," she shouted over the noise. She grabbed Claire's hand and pulled her into the room, avoiding the gaze of the reflections as much as possible. At the center of the room stood a pedestal with two objects, a small hourglass filled with black sand and a cracked porcelain mask. A sign beneath them read, "Choose to conceal or choose to reveal." "What does it mean?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Emily didn't answer. She stared at the objects, weighing the decision. Finally, she grabbed the mask, feeling its cold surface send a shiver through her hand. The hourglass shattered instantly, the black sand dispersing into the air. The moment Emily picked up the mask, the mirrored versions of themselves moved. They pressed against the glass, their blank faces morphing into grotesque smiles. The glass began to crack, spiderwebbing under the pressure. "Put it back," Claire screamed, but Emily couldn't. The mask was stuck to her hand, burning like ice. "We have to get out of here," Emily shouted, dragging Claire toward the far door as the mirrors shattered, releasing their distorted reflections into the room. The broken reflections moved toward them, their jagged forms scraping against the floor. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, as though they were learning how to use their limbs. Emily yanked the door open, but the hallway beyond had changed again, twisting into an endless spiral staircase. "We have no choice," she said, pulling Claire through. The reflections followed their distorted laughter echoing behind them. The staircase was infinite, spiraling down into darkness. Each step felt heavier, as though the air itself was resisting their descent. Claire stumbled, clutching Emily for support. Above them, the broken reflections leaned over the banister, staring down. Their laughter turned into screams, sharp and piercing. "We can't stop," Emily said, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Whatever's down there has to be better than what's up here." As they descended the staircase, Emily's heart pounded in her chest, the air growing thicker with each step. The dim glow of the symbols above them faded, leaving them in near-complete darkness. Suddenly, a piercing eye appeared beneath one of the steps. It blinked slowly, then locked its gaze on them. Claire froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Emily nodded, her grip tightening on the railing. "It's watching us." The moment they stepped onto the next landing, the whispers returned, louder, sharper. This time they weren't just voices. The whispers seemed to tug at their very thoughts, slipping into their minds and twisting their memories. "Don't listen to them," Emily warned, but the voices grew louder, each one speaking in a language older than time. Claire's face contorted in confusion. I don't understand. I can't stop hearing them." At the end of the stairs was another hallway, this one completely black. The walls were charred as if burned by some unearthly fire, yet there was no smell of smoke. The air felt cold, biting, and alive. As they stepped into the hallway, a gust of wind slammed the door shut behind them, trapping them inside. Claire reached for the doorknob, but recoiled. "It's not real. None of this is real." A shadow moved at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, human-like, yet distorted, stretching and contracting unnaturally. Emily's heart raced. "Don't make a sound," she whispered, but it was too late. The shadow turned, locking eyes with them, its features mirrors completely obscured. The creature tilted its head and began to glide toward them, its movements smooth like oil. "Run!" Emily shouted, yanking Claire by the arm. As they ran, the hallway began to shift again. The walls collapsed in on themselves, twisting into tight, claustrophobic corridors. The space seemed to warp with every step, the very geometry of the room defying logic. "Where are we?" Claire screamed, her voice echoing off the changing walls. The sound became distorted, stretching and warping until it no longer resembled anything human. They finally stumbled into another room, a small, circular chamber with a single, low door on the other side. The moment they entered, the world around them seemed to freeze. Time stretched like taffy, distorting the air, making every second feel like an eternity. The air was thick with tension. "What is this place?" Claire whispered as the minutes crawled by. Emily's mind felt sluggish, her thoughts slowing down as if the room itself was consuming time. The door across the room began to shimmer, slowly fading in and out of existence. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. "We have to go through it now," Emily insisted, her voice trembling with urgency. With each second, the door grew more translucent, flickering like an old film reel. As they ran toward it, the walls began to close in, and the door vanished completely, leaving only an empty, blackened space. "No, no, no!" Claire cried. Suddenly, figures began to materialize in the darkness, flickering in and out like lost souls. Their faces were blank, as if they had no identities, but their eyes, empty, hollow eyes, locked onto Emily and Claire with an unsettling intensity. "Are they us?" Claire whispered, backing away. "They look like us, like versions of us, but not." Emily's stomach twisted. "I don't know, but we have to keep moving." The figures began to move closer, their eyes fixed on the two women. The deeper Emily looked into them, the more she realized their faces weren't empty. They were filled with darkness, and inside that darkness were reflections of their own fears, mirrored back at them. I can't take it anymore," Claire whispered, her voice breaking. Emily grabbed her arm. "We don't have a choice. We have to face this." The figures began to whisper, their voices overlapping with their own thoughts, feeding their insecurities and driving them to madness. The walls of the chamber began to turn into mirrors, reflecting every angle of the room. Each mirror showed a different version of Emily and Claire, versions of them trapped in endless despair, faces contorted in pain. One mirror reflected Claire, but her face was twisted into a monstrous grin. Emily gasped. "That's not you," she whispered, but the Claire in the mirror moved without her, staring back at them as if mocking their every move. "That's what they want to do," Emily murmured. "They want to trap us in these reflections." The mirrors continued to multiply around them, the twisted versions of their own reflections closing in. Suddenly, something invisible pressed against Emily's back, its fingers cold and unyielding. She gasped, unable to move, as if an unseen force was holding her in place. "Emily!" Claire cried, reaching out for her. But the moment Claire touched her, she was pulled away by the same unseen force. The room was alive, the air thick with malevolent energy. "We're not alone," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. As the room twisted and shifted, the whispers returned, but this time they came from the mirrors themselves, not the walls. The reflections of Emily and Claire began to speak, their voices a mix of the women's own tones, twisted and jagged. "You can't escape," they whispered. "You'll never leave." The reflections began to move independently, mocking their every action. "You're trapped here just like us," the reflection of Claire said, its voice cold and hollow. "This place doesn't let go." The reflections began to smile, too wide, too unnatural. Their grins stretched impossibly across their faces, their eyes empty voids that seemed to stare into the very core of their souls. The room felt colder, the air thick with dread. "We need to get out of here now," Emily muttered, backing toward the door. But the moment she reached for the handle, it evaporated, fading into the walls like a wisp of smoke. Claire screamed, pounding on the wall. "It's all in our heads. We have to get out of here." Desperation clawed at them. They ran to the other side of the room, but the door that had been there moments ago was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of mirrors. Their reflections continued to mimic their every movement, always one step ahead. The shadows in the mirrors grew darker, shifting and coiling. It felt as though the room itself was alive, watching them, waiting. "It's feeding off our fear," Emily realized, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't let it control us." Suddenly, the floor beneath them gave way, and they found themselves falling. When they hit the ground, they were in a new room, an endless corridor lined with eyes, hundreds of them, blinking sitting and unblinking, all staring at them from the walls. "They're watching us," Claire breathed, her voice hoarse. "We're being watched." The eyes followed their every movement, their gaze unnerving and cold. Some were human, others animalistic, but all shared the same chilling emptiness. The hallway stretched out infinitely, the eyes never blinking, never looking away. A heartbeat pulsed from within the walls of the hallway. Slow, steady, but undeniably real. It echoed in the silence, vibrating through the air, and it felt like it was coming from somewhere deep within the building itself. "What is that?" Claire whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding rhythm. Emily's heart raced in response, each beat matching the sound. "I don't know," she said, her voice thick with fear, "but we have to keep moving." As they walked, the eyes began to move. They followed them down the hallway, their gaze sharp and unblinking. Some of the eyes turned red, glowing like burning coals, and began to twitch violently. It felt as though something was stalking them, drawing closer with every step. "I can't take this anymore," Claire cried, her voice cracking. "They're not just watching us, they're hunting us." The walls seemed to close in around them, and the heartbeat grew louder, faster, as though it were now chasing them, not the other way around. The air grew heavier, thick with something tangible and suffocating. The floor beneath them began to tremble. A low growl rumbled from the depths of the corridor, deep and menacing. Emily stopped dead in her tracks. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Before Claire could answer, the walls shook violently. A shadow darted across the hall, too quick to see, but leaving behind a trail of cold air. It was close, too close. The heartbeat quickened to an unbearable speed, drowning out all other sounds. A dim light appeared in the distance, faint but visible. It was the only source of hope they had seen for what felt like forever. Without a word, they started running toward it, desperation fueling their steps. The heartbeat pounded louder, deafening like it was right behind them, and the air grew colder with every second. The growl from the shadows echoed behind them, closer now, as though it were chasing them, its breath hot on their heels. "Don't look back," Emily warned, her voice strained. "We can't stop." They burst into the light, only to find themselves in another room, this one far more unsettling than the last. It was circular with no windows and only one door on the far side. But as they stepped into the center, the door slammed shut behind them, locking them in. The room was dark, except for a single, dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was an old wooden chair. A single man's voice, deep and raspy, echoed from the corners. "Sit." The voice in the room was unnervingly calm, commanding them to sit in the chair in the center. Emily's pulse raced. It wasn't an option. It felt like a demand. She glanced at Claire, who was frozen, her face pale, eyes wide with dread. "No," Emily whispered. "We don't do this. We don't obey it." But the room seemed to hum with energy, vibrating under their feet as the chair beckoned them closer, its dark wooden frame creaking. Emily tried to move, but her legs felt heavy and sluggish, as if the room itself was making it harder to move. She reached out to touch Claire, but before her fingers could make contact, something icy cold brushed against her neck. A chill ran through her body. Claire shivered, too. "That wasn't you," Claire whispered, her voice shaking. "What was that?" The air had turned frigid, the temperature dropping so quickly it felt like their breath was freezing in the air. The voice came again, deeper now, almost as if it were a part of the room itself. "Sit." But this time, it wasn't coming from the air. It was behind them, right behind their ears, close enough to feel a cold breath on their necks. Without turning, Emily grabbed Claire's hand and yanked her forward. "We can't stay here. We have to keep moving." But the moment she moved, the voice grew louder, sharper. "Sit." It was no longer a suggestion, it was a command. As they moved, the walls began to shift, their surfaces darkening, turning as black as night. The room seemed to close in on them with every step they took, the walls growing taller and more oppressive, as if they were sinking into the earth itself. "We're running out of space," Claire whispered, panic rising in her voice. The once expansive room was now shrinking. The edges of the walls pressed inward like a trap, and the weight of the air pressed down harder with every breath. Suddenly, a heavy force pressed against Emily's chest, knocking the air from her lungs. She gasped, stumbling back into Claire. It was as if the room had hands, invisible but undeniable, holding them captive. They couldn't move. "You can't leave." The voice spoke again, this time from all around them. It wasn't just the air now, it was inside their heads. The room shook violently, rattling the walls, and causing the chair in the center to spin wildly, as if the room itself was angry. The darkness thickened until it was impossible to see. All that remained were the flickering shadows, moving unnaturally. As their eyes adjusted, twisted. Emily could make out distorted faces appearing in the blackness, their mouths stretched in grotesque smiles, their eyes wide open in a twisted version of glee. "No," Claire whispered, backing away. "Please don't let them get closer." The faces shifted, closing the distance between them, their smiles growing wider, their eyes darker. The faces grew more detailed with each passing moment. The shadows seemed to take on human forms, but wrong. So wrong. They were twisted and disfigured, like people who had been stretched beyond recognition, their eyes hollow, skin pulled tight like leather. "Help us," one whispered. "Please," another moaned. The screams echoed around them, coming from every corner of the room, louder and louder, until it felt like they were drowning in sound. Then from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, stretching into the darkness. Its face was twisted into a monstrous grin, eyes gleaming with an unholy light. It laughed, a deep, guttural laugh that seemed to reverberate in their bones. "Did you think you could escape?" the figure asked in a voice that made the room shake, its words twisted like barbed wire in their minds. "You are already part of this place." The floor beneath them began to crack, the sound like bones snapping. Each step they took seemed to deepen the fissures. Emily grabbed Claire's hand tighter, both of them stumbling backward as the floor split wide open. "I can't," Claire gasped. "I can't feel my legs." The air was becoming unbearable, the weight of the room pushing them lower into the cracked floor. It felt like they were being dragged downward into something far worse. With a final, thunderous crack, the floor gave way entirely, and they were plunged into darkness. It wasn't just a fall, it was a plunge into a bottomless pit. The darkness around them seemed to open into an endless void, an abyss that seemed to stretch forever. "Help!" Claire screamed as they fell, but her voice was swallowed up by the void. The walls disappeared, and the only thing that existed was the falling, endless darkness. Time stretched unnaturally as they fell, spiraling through a void that seemed to stretch on forever. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of their own breaths, shallow and frantic. Every inch of their bodies felt heavy, as though the darkness itself was pressing down on them. "Where are we?" Claire's voice cracked, barely audible, but no answer came. It was as if the abyss had swallowed her words before they could reach Emily. Suddenly, a whisper broke the silence, soft, distant. At first, it was faint, like a voice carried on the wind, but it grew louder, clearer, until it seemed to echo in their minds. "They never leave," the voice said, low and mournful. "They are part of the endless, just like you." The words seemed to swirl around them, growing louder, until the air itself vibrated with the sound. Then, as suddenly as the fall began, it stopped. The two women found themselves standing, disoriented, on solid ground. But the ground wasn't solid. It was soft and spongy, like it was breathing. It undulated beneath their feet. The walls were now closing in on them, moving, twisting like living creatures. They could see them shifting, growing larger with each passing moment. The space between them and the walls was shrinking, suffocating them in its grip. A faint glow illuminated the walls, revealing thousands of eyes, all watching them, unblinking. They were everywhere, on the floor, the ceiling, the walls, eyes that followed their every move. Some of the eyes were human, others animal-like, and some were nothing at all but gaping black voids. Claire reached out for Emily's hand, her grip tightening. "Do you see them?" she gasped. "They're watching us, all of them." The shadows around them twisted and slithered like living things. They reached out, caressing the walls and the floor, their whispers growing louder. The voices were disembodied, overlapping each other, all speaking at once. "They come for you," one whispered. "There is no escape," another hissed. "You belong here now," a third voice crooned. It was an unholy chorus that filled the air, making their heads spin. Out of the corner of her eye, Emily saw it, a shape darker than the rest of the shadows, moving toward them. It was tall, impossibly tall, with arms that stretched down to the ground, fingers twitching like spiders' legs. The figure emerged fully from the darkness, its face obscured by a veil of shadow. But its presence was unmistakable, its aura one of complete, unfathomable malice. "You shouldn't have come here," it growled, its voice low and guttural. The air around them seemed to grow colder, the temperature plummeting as the figure stepped closer. The weight of the figure's words hung in the air, suffocating them. Fear began to claw at their chests, squeezing the life out of them with every passing second. Emily tried to back away, but the floor beneath her feet shifted, refusing to let her move. Claire's breathing grew ragged, her chest heaving with panic. "We're not supposed to be here," Emily whispered. "We can't be here without Without warning, the figure's hand shot out, its fingers wrapping around Emily's arm. The touch was cold, so cold it felt like her very soul was being drained from her body. It wasn't just the chill of the touch, it was the deep, ancient cold of something that had existed long before human life began. Her skin burned where it made contact, as if it were being seared by ice. She cried out, trying to break free, but the figure's grip only tightened. The figure slowly lifted its head, revealing its face, or what should have been a face. The skin was stretched too tight, as if it was made from something other than flesh. Its eyes were hollow, two black pits that seemed to pull in everything around them. "They are here," it whispered, "and now you are too." The words slithered into their minds, planting seeds of terror that rooted deep within their souls. The very air around them began to hum, vibrating with a power that felt as though it could crush them at any moment. Suddenly, everything shifted. The walls, the shadows, the figure. It all began to bend, warping, as if the very fabric of reality had snapped. The ground split beneath their feet, the darkness pulling away to reveal another place, another world. It was like they were being ripped from one reality and thrust into another. The shift was disorienting. One moment they were surrounded by twisted walls and shadows, and the next they were standing in an open field, empty, lifeless. But they knew better. The air had changed, but the terror hadn't. It was waiting for them. The field they found themselves in was vast, endless, it seemed. The ground beneath their feet was covered in gray dust, like ash from a long extinguished fire. The sky above was a dull, lifeless color, not quite day, not quite night. It was as if the very atmosphere had been drained of all color, leaving only a sickly, ashen hue. What is this place?" Claire's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted around, as though expecting something to emerge from the dark horizon at any moment. They stood there for a moment, frozen in place, the silence thick and suffocating. Then faintly at first they heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking toward them from the far end of the field. Emily's heart raced. "We're not alone," she muttered, her eyes scanning the barren land for any sign of movement. The footsteps grew louder and closer, but no one appeared. It was as though the sound itself was coming from the ground, echoing through the field. Suddenly, figures began to appear on the horizon, but they weren't people. They were shadows, tall, shifting, moving like dark silhouettes, their features impossible to make out. As they drew closer, the air grew thicker, the weight of their presence pressing down on the two women. "We need to move," Emily said, grabbing Claire's arm. But Claire was frozen, her eyes wide in horror. "They're watching us," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "They've been watching us this whole time." The shadows stopped, standing motionless at the edge of the field, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't merely observing them. They were judging them, waiting for something. "We have to get out of here," Emily urged, but it was as if the field itself was holding them in place. The earth beneath their feet seemed to have become sticky, pulling them back with every attempt to move. The eyes, glowing like fireflies in the distance, never blinked, and they never looked away. Suddenly, a sharp pull wrenched at Emily's chest, as if an invisible chain had latched onto her. She gasped, stumbling forward, but her feet felt glued to the ground. It wasn't just the pressure, it was the weight of something far more sinister. "It's pulling us," Claire cried, reaching out for Emily, but she couldn't move either. It was as though they were tethered to the field by something beyond their control. A gust of wind whipped through the field, howling like a living thing. The wind wasn't normal. It carried with it a screeching, high-pitched sound that pierced their eardrums and rattled their bones. It felt like the very atmosphere around them was alive, like something was trying to tear them apart. "We're not alone," Claire whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "We're being hunted." She could feel it too now, an overwhelming sense of being surrounded, of something stalking them just out of sight. The wind suddenly stopped, and the field fell eerily silent. But the ground beneath them wasn't solid anymore. It shifted like a vast, hollow pit, the earth trembling under their feet. Emily felt as though the ground was alive, as if it were ready to swallow them whole. "We need to get to the edge," Emily said urgently, her heart pounding in her chest. "We have to find a way out of here." But as they took a step, the ground cracked open, revealing a chasm so deep it seemed to descend into the very bowels of the earth. A faint glow emanated from the abyss, drawing them closer, as though it was calling to them. The figures on the horizon had begun to move again, slowly advancing toward them, but still silent. Their presence was overwhelming, like a storm on the horizon, and Emily could feel the air growing thicker, suffocating her with its weight. She couldn't breathe, "Do you hear that?" Claire gasped, eyes wide with panic. But Emily didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no voices, only a deafening silence. The very air felt like it was closing in on them. Then the silence broke. Soft voices began to drift through the wind, distant yet somehow close. They were unintelligible, a chorus of whispers that seemed to swirl around them, growing louder with each passing second. "Not for long," one whispered. "You'll never leave," another voice hissed. The words were unclear, but the intent behind them was unmistakable, malicious, threatening. The wind carried them, wrapping around their minds, sinking into their thoughts like poison. The shadows had reached the edge of the field. They were close now, close enough that Emily could make out their features, or the lack of them. They were nothing more than empty forms, their faces obscured by dark veils, their bodies shifting like smoke. But the eyes, they were unmistakable. Thousands of glowing eyes watching them. It was as if they were being judged, as though these entities were deciding their fate. There was no escape from the feeling of being surrounded. As the shadowy figures closed in, a sudden, sharp clarity pierced through the fog of fear that had enveloped Emily. For a split second, she could see them for what they truly were, not beings of flesh and blood, but grotesque shapes formed of darkness, as if they were stitched together from the very fabric of the void. They were not alive. They were not dead. They were something else entirely. "Claire," Emily whispered, gripping her friend's arm tighter. "We need to leave now." Just as Emily pulled Claire toward the edge of the field, a force gripped her, a hand that wasn't there, an invisible presence that wrapped around her throat like a tightening vice. She gasped for air, her lungs burning, but no one touched her. The shadows didn't need to physically restrain them. Claire screamed, desperately tugging at Emily, but it was as if the air itself had become their enemy. Emily's vision blurred. The last thing she saw was the eerie glow from the chasm beneath their feet, swallowing everything whole. Emily's body felt heavier than ever before, as if she were dragging the weight of the entire universe on her shoulders. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The shadows had surrounded them, their eyes now the only light in the darkened world. The whispers had become a cacophony, a maddening sound that reverberated through her skull. And then, in the corner of her eye, she saw something, or rather, someone, a figure standing in the distance. It was human in shape, but shrouded in darkness. "Emily," Claire said, weakly, her voice trembling. Is that someone?" The figure remained still, unmoving, but Emily could feel its gaze on her. It was different from the shadows. It didn't seem to belong to this world. Its presence was like a gravitational pull, drawing her toward it, yet something within her screamed to stay away. The whispers faded as if the figure had silenced them, but Emily could still hear the dull echo of her own heartbeat in her ears. She found herself taking slow, involuntary steps toward it, each one heavier than the last. As she got closer, the temperature dropped sharply. It wasn't just cold, it was a soul-deep chill, as if the very essence of life had been drained from the air. She could see her breath now, clouding the space in front of her face. The figure's features remained hidden, but a voice, a low and gravelly whisper, filled her mind. "You shouldn't have come here." Emily stopped in her tracks, paralyzed by the voice. It wasn't coming from the figure's mouth. No, the voice was coming from everywhere, from within her, a deep, unshakable terror that wrapped around her heart. The moment the voice spoke, everything clicked. This wasn't just a random stretch of highway. This wasn't some forgotten ghost town. They had stumbled into a place of eternal torment, a place where the living and the dead had crossed paths and were trapped in an endless loop of despair. "You're not leaving," the voice continued. "None of you do. Not ever." Emily's legs wobbled beneath her. She could hear Claire sobbing behind her, but the sound felt distant, almost as if she were no longer truly there. She had been drawn into something much larger than she could comprehend, a nightmare with no escape. A harsh, bone-chilling wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of decay and despair. The world around them began to distort, the horizon bending in unnatural ways, twisting like a funhouse mirror. The shadows that had once been still began to shift, flowing like liquid darkness, moving in ways that defied physics. Time itself seemed to bend. The seconds stretched out into eternity, while entire moments seemed to disappear. Emily reached for Claire, her fingers trembling. "We have to hold on just a little longer," but it was already too late. The edges of their reality were unraveling before their eyes. The field was no longer just a field. The chasm beneath them had expanded, swallowing the ground, stretching out until it was all that remained, an abyss of endless darkness. The edges of the void seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, as if it was breathing, waiting for them to fall into its depths. A low rumbling sound filled the air, like the earth itself was coming undone. The figure, still in the distance, had begun to move, but its steps were slow, deliberate, as if it knew time had no meaning here. And then, the ground beneath Emily's feet cracked. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the earth trembled beneath them. She tried to back away, to escape, but the ground seemed to open wider, pulling her closer to the chasm. Claire screamed her name, but it was as if her voice was being swallowed by the expanding void. "We can't stay here," Emily shouted, pulling Claire toward the last remaining patch of solid ground. "There has to be a way out." But even as she spoke, she knew it was hopeless. The air was too thick with dread. The shadows were closing in, and every part of her body screamed for release. With nowhere left to run, Emily and Claire turned toward the figure, now close enough for Emily to see the faint outline of its face. There was no humanity in it, only the chilling reflection of their own fear. "Do you choose?" the figure asked, its voice like the sound of cracking ice. The question hung in the air, pregnant with 1,000 meanings. The ground beneath their feet crumbled, the abyss opening wide. Emily could feel the terror inside her welling up, but she had to make a choice: stay and face the endless nightmare, or fall into the abyss.